But is he the victim of, frankly, his own behaviour? Did he, as was judged, actually act as a bully, even though he didn't think he was bullying, of civil servants, and basically, maker of his own downfall? Or is he the victim of a highly politicised activist civil service out to get anyone they don't like? Don't like many Conservatives, but they definitely don't like Brexiteer Conservatives. Well, let's talk about this with David Davis, not only a Tory MP and a former government minister as Brexit Secretary himself, but also Dominic Raab's former boss. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into the details, you working with Dominic Raab, do you think that do you think that Dominic Raab should have resigned?
Well, I know why he did, because he undertook to. He made a promise, frankly, and Dominic's a very honourable chap, and he lives by his promises. But he worked for me in a very tough job. We were battling the Blair government over everything from 90 days to Home Secretaries being fired.
He was your chief of staff when you were Shadow Home Secretary.
And I never saw him bully anybody at any time. I mean, he's a tough cookie. I mean, he's tough on himself. He works incredibly hard. He's very clever. But actually, nearly all the staff around him were very, very loyal to him. They thought he was a terrific boss. So what's going on here is an accusation of bullying, which frankly left me open-mouthed. I mean, in one of the cases, I mean, most of the cases were dismissed, by the way, but yeah. In one of the cases, you have a man who's our ambassador, it turns out, who overstepped the mark laid down by cabinet. And a lot of,
let's clarify. It's the Spanish ambassador who basically said we should have border force officials from Spain in Gibraltar. He suggested this, even though this had been expressly decided this would not happen by the British democratically elected cabinet. I mean, I'm sorry, not only did he overstep the mark, I mean, it was gross misconduct. He should have been sacked on the spot.
Yeah, well, that's on the streets of my constituency on Saturday. That's precisely what people were saying to me. Why wasn't he fired? Why wasn't the ambassador fired? And and I have some sympathy with that. And the other cases, I mean, you've got civil servants. Bear in mind, these people are not sort of lowly paid. They're not Waitrose workers, as you were talking about before. These are people. Well, I mean, there's 100 of them paid over 200,000 a year. Yeah. I mean, several hundred paid.
How do they get by?
How they get by? Terrible. So these are not little shrinking by.
And these are the sort of the top first from Oxford and Cambridge on the fast track. They're the people dealing with high level, supposedly highly educated, highly intelligent, top track people.
Their union is called the very self-regarding title of the First Division Association. Yeah. That's how high rank they are now. And some of them were he challenged them to explain why this £100 million budget of taxpayers' money was what it was, and explain the background data and so on. And they didn't like that. And when he asked them again, that's when they accused him of bullying. So this sort of thing, in the private sector, they think we're bonkers. Frankly, yeah. I mean, we all have to earn our living. Well, when I was in the private sector, I had to earn a living, and I had to defend my corner. And yet somehow this is not expected. And of course, the point you were referring to earlier, I was sitting here thinking, I wonder if I could get away with being 18 or 17.
Of course you could, David. Of course you could.
These failures in the civil service are becoming rampant. I mean, you didn't mention it, but in the Home Office, for example, you've got barely one case a week being cleared by a caseworker. It should be like 40, not one. Now, these failures, whether it's over giving you your driving license or your passport or whatever, you need ministers to be able to demand standards.
But it's also a failure of the top levels of the civil service. I mean, again, we look at the Partygate affair. I'm still amazed that there's some cases in his job. I absolutely blame Boris Johnson on this and have done very prominently on this show again and again. But Simon Case was the Cabinet Secretary. The reason why he didn't do the Sue Gray report was because he'd been at one of the parties. It was in his office. I mean, it is extraordinary, the lack of correct, proper leadership, but also expectation. This is the key thing. There does seem to be this idea that you can just do bad work and it doesn't matter, even though you're being paid by taxpayers. But also, you can just basically try and undermine government policy, because I do think there seems to be something going on here. The people have been targeted. Look, there are some people, Gavin Williamson, he fell by his own sword. Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Suella Braverman, they it does appear, I mean, that these people are being targeted by an activist Remainer civil service.
Now, I don't know what's behind that aspect of this report. I can't. Some things you can work out from the report, some you can't. But what I can say to you is clearly some parts of the civil service are obstructionist. I don't understand passive aggression. I'm too old-fashioned. But they're obstructionist with respect to government policy. I saw it when I was Brexit Secretary just before Dominic was. I had to call in a head of a department. A really, really senior head of department and say, what you were given this instruction 6 months ago. Why has no finger been lifted to do it? In the last 6 months, and I had to do it with the then cabinet secretary sitting there to make sure he got the point.
And in the private sector, that person would be sacked, and quite rightly. I've asked you to do a job, and you've not done it.
Out on his ear would be in the private sector. So there is a sense of entitlement about it, and it's got worse after COVID. You've got permanent secretaries saying, "Oh, look, we can all work from home." No, you can't. You can't do a job on Zoom. We can talk to each other on Zoom. I would have much rather do it in the interview room because it's easy. You get a better outcome in meetings.
But also in terms of just being able to just be colleagues, and we saw this with the Kabul airlift 2 years ago. That you need to have people in the room who can access the computer and say, "Oh, hold on a minute, I've got a problem with this one. Can you help me?" Oh yeah, brilliant. It's pooling resources, it's ideas, it's making people it's a better work atmosphere. You get more done. If working from home was so efficient, there wouldn't be passport delays, there wouldn't be delays in getting driving licences, and someone at the council might actually answer the phone occasionally. Let me ask you also in terms of a lot...
They would have been doing it for years if that was the case. They would have been on it, but they don't.
They don't, exactly. And again, the private sector, where they have done it, they're doing it, they don't want to do it. They're trying to get people back in the office.
They're going back.
What do you make of the people who are claiming to be sort of clutching their pearls and being terribly upset and, Dominic Raab has behaved like a bully? And again, he was found by this very detailed report. He's never shouted, he's never sworn, he's never thrown anything. Now, that's quite a high bar. We accept that. But obviously, talking in the wrong tone of voice to somebody who is highly paid and doesn't do their job. Does that pass the threshold for bullying for most of us who work in the private sector? I would say not. But what's fascinating, those who are clutching their pearls saying, it's absolutely terrible. How awful people have had to work in this terrible circumstance. I don't remember a lot of these people, and yes, they've been around as long as you and me. They didn't seem to be upset about Gordon Brown, who used to throw phones, and I think on one occasion a fax machine at a member of staff in anger. John Prescott had sex on his desk with his secretary, possibly 2 different secretaries. John Bercow, Commons Speaker, he was known to have been a bully, found a report to have been a bully, and yet a lot of the people clutching their pearls now on the Remainer left-wing Labour side were happy to defend him and keep him in the job, in charge of numerous very junior staff in the House of Commons, because he was politically useful. So much of this is a political attack, not a moral case, isn't it?
Well, I think... TMI there, by the way. I'd rather not hear some of those stories. But I think I would more accurately describe it, I think, as groupthink. You have a whole load of people who all have the same opinion, and they then think, of course, that's the absolute truth. And you saw, we saw it with Brexit. With Brexit in the civil service in London, massively predominant Remainer. And so they thought, the government taken a leave of its senses. And so they thought they should resist it. Similar things in other areas. This is where this phrase, the blob, comes from. It may not be a sort of Labour Party thing or whatever, but it is, our establishment view. We think we know better. And the trouble is, they have to remember that they're employed to carry out the public will, whether that is the will through a referendum or more normally the will of an appointed minister who's effectively elected by the public at large. And that's what predominates. And if you don't agree with it, then go get a job somewhere else.
Exactly. Can I ask you just finally about the situation in Sudan? You're as a former government minister. There's a British embassy staff were airlifted out of Khartoum. Hundreds, possibly even a few thousand Brits, some claiming they've been abandoned in Sudan. Has the British government done the right thing?
Well, it has to do what it did for the embassy staff, because they would probably be under direct threat, I imagine. But, I'm not briefed on this, so I don't know the details. But I imagine there's quite a lot of effort going on now with respect to anybody they think's at risk, and that will be going on. I've got no doubt about that.
OK. So, again, as we saw with Kabul, though, fantastic work and very brave work by our boys and girls, on the ground, the military. But actually, and again, I think, the ambassador also stayed there on the ground as long as possible. But I just think an awful lot of people just feel that they're not entirely sure that when civil servants are working behind the scenes, they are actually getting the job done. David Davis, a pleasure to speak to you, former Brexit Secretary, of course, Dominic Raab's former boss.